Grazie mille. Grazie. Benissimo. Buonasera.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I wish to thank very much the organizers. I would like to thank them for inviting me. I'm very honored and happy to be here today. My speech, as announced by Francesco Torman, is entitled Emptiness as a Form of the World for a Contemporary Philosophy of Relation. It is maybe a title that could sound a bit arrogant, and you will forgive me, but I will not really say many original thing, and I will limit myself to go back to concepts and words that we can find in the texts and that are somehow fundamental to define and frame what we may call Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. I also have to say that I've listened with great interest to all of the speakers who preceded me, and I would like also to point out that my contribution that comes at the end should have come earlier, because it starts from very well-known ideas and an analysis of basic terms. To try and get and explain and understand what could mean
uno sguardo sul mondo,
a look onto the world that looks at the world as emptiness. And so we're going to get to Nagarjuna, who has already been mentioned. But I would like to introduce the constellation, the synthesis of the constellation of terms around which we move that are familiar and well-known: Anatman, Shunya Shunyata, and Pratitya Samutpada. So non-self, emptiness, void. Translations can differ. Dependent co-origination. These are key terms that make up the core of theory and doctrine of Buddhism. And here, I would like to show the path we're going to do together, because I would like to bring this word to life through the relevant texts, especially when we talk about the illusion of self, the self as a burden, the I as a product, so as a result and not as a center and origin. A founding element from which the different processes stem: thought, action, or passions. And emptiness of the world, as expressed within the suttas, where it is said, the world is empty, the world is empty. What does it mean that the world is empty? Then we're going to get through here to Nagarjuna's quotes to frame the meaning of the expression void or emptiness as a synonym of Pratitya Samutpada, because this is an operation that in the Nagarjunian text becomes essential. So, illusion of self. You will all recognize everything that appears familiar, starting from these fundamental terms I've just mentioned. I'm going to read. I will speak about the burden, who bears the burden, who puts down the burden. What is the burden? It is a complex of the 5 attachments. Panchudapaskanda. So the complex of attachment to form, attachment to sensation, to perception, the sankhara, and consciousness. This is called burden. And who is the bearer of the burden? The individual, one must say. And what is the bearing the burden is that thirst that brings to rebirth, together with pleasure and coveting, which founds pleasure here and there. So thirst for pleasure, existence, non-existence. And what is it to put down the burden? Is the total removal, dissolution, abandonment, rejection of that thirst, liberating from it, detached from it. This is meant by putting down the burden. So it is very clear from the text. It doesn't need any comments, but I would like to highlight one fact, that the self is presented in the teachings as an illusion, a mirage, a delusion, a construction, a fake construction that has an importance inside the experience and a real weight. And however, still, it is possible to unmask this nature of construction, illusion, and delusion. And we can then recognize the burden as such, as construct, as illusion, as deceiving, and then we can detach from it and liberate ourselves from it. So the illusion of the self first. So this is a text that, like many other texts that are present in the canonic suttas, show the nature, the co-produced nature, we might say, of the illusion of the self, co-produced with the skanda, upadana skanda, so groups, skanda, okanda, of appropriation. What does it mean? Strength, forces, 5 forces that are listed here, that in their reciprocal and instantaneous interaction act by producing a tension which creates the I, which creates a self. So my I, or the I that is mine. So here we have the result of an action. What I wanted to highlight is actually the element that is produced of the self, and the being, the self is a result, never a principle or an origin, as one might think. So here, any type of material form, any type of aggregates, groups of appropriation, like in Upa, Vedana, Sanya, material forms, sankhara, perception, volition, mental formation, consciousness, vijnana, should be seen with wisdom in the following way. This is not mine, this is not me, this is not myself. And this should be seen as a nature of construction, mirage, deceiving, and we should then recognize the impossibility of identification, the impossibility of identifying oneself with what has no consistency. So here there is a quote that was mentioned just moments ago by Professor Cestari from Melinda Pagna, where the wise monk Nagasena tries to instruct the curious Remlinda in terms of the deepest meaning of the teaching of the Buddha, the central fundamental teaching concerning the non-self of self, non-self of the person, and what really turns upside down the king, but then fills up with surprise in the solution of the question. Surprises the king when he understands the deepest teaching, the deepest meaning of the teaching. So basically we start by saying, here there is no Nagasena, here there's no person. And this obviously surprises the king, who is asking for more information, and the dialogue that ensues, which is amazing, should be a piece of theater, explains through a very famous metaphor, the metaphor of the chariot, the deepest meaning of the teaching. Because one might think, and I'm sorry if I take a minute here, one might think that self is not given in the terms in which ordinary men are used to think about it. However, we can admit that some faculties or some functions together create this self. So even this perspective in this extraordinary text is demolished. It is not enough, it is not sufficient. Actually, it's actually not the sum of the parts that creates a chariot. If I put together the wheel, all the bits of the chariot, I will not have a chariot. So the result of this reiterated reconstruction of the meaning of the teachings underlines this. In virtue of. What does it mean it's in virtue of? Hair, tendons, heart, liver, spleen, bile, fat, tears, saliva, everything in virtue of 5 khandhas: material form, sensation, perception, and conscious, that Nagasena exists. But how does Nagasena exist? Nagasena exists as the name, as a designation, as the sign that a convention has decided that does not correspond to any substance, does not correspond to any ontological concrete thing, and no identity, principle, no action, volition, feeling, etc., etc.
L'io è un nome. Quindi abbiamo detto.
So the I is a product, the I is a burden, the I is an illusion, because the I is a product, because the I is a name, and all of this can only mean that the world is empty. And that the world is empty, just like I was saying before, is not something that is only said in the sutras of Mahayana. It is also written in the texts of the canon, in the suttas of the ancient Buddhism.
Vedete com'è a proposito di... Quindi io non vi ho dato il testo sott'occhio.
So I didn't give you the text exactly. She didn't give us the text. So I wasn't reading the text as an interpreter, sorry.
Ma vi faccio soltanto una carrellata. L'io è un prodotto, l'io è un nome, il mondo è vuoto. Siamo qui sempre all'interno di un sutta canonico.
So we are within a canonic sutta where Ananda asks to the Buddha, the world is empty, the world is empty. Yes, sir, but how is the world empty? Because the world, Ananda, is empty of substance, empty of substantiality. The world is empty. And why Ananda is empty of substance, empty of substantiality? Because Ananda, the sight is empty of substance, the forms are empty, any sensation is empty.
Qui, quindi l'espressione.
So the expression, the term, the attribute empty functions as the term anatta, in Pali anatman, non-self. So we can treat those as synonyms, and the fact that the world is empty means that the world is empty of selfity, of self, of ontological consistence. And so this, starting from emptiness, from the ontological inconsistence of the constituents of all the factors, of all the groups that constitute, through reciprocal action, the constructed illusion of self. So the world is empty, and it is already clear that the world is empty. The point being that normally in historical and philosophical and religious reconstructions, basically the tendency is to differentiate a face of Buddhism compared to another. And in ancient Buddhism, the accent is on reflections on the self, so pondering on the self. And the focus is a focus on the critical deconstruction of the idea of self, of this powerful device, which is a matrix, which is a notorious matrix of suffering, which chains us to the world.
Distinzione, no?
And there is a traditional distinction between faces, and starting from the reflection, from the variation of Mahayana Buddhism, variation on the theme of Mahayana Buddhism, we experience some kind of extension of this thought of non-substantiality to a dimension that is a cosmic and universal, dimension that we define dharmic. So from the non-self to the non-self of all dharmas, all the elements of the experience that will constitute the experience of all things. So we could, but obviously there are people who are much more competent here than me on the subject. I dare say that this vision this perspective that is relevant to non-self and to the things that constitute the experience of the world is already present in the Buddhism that precedes the experience of the great vehicle. This is what I make out of reading many different terms. And now, very gently, because I know I'm on a faulty terrain here, probably I don't have enough competencies.
Giungo a un altro.
I get to another key notion, which is Paticca Samutpada in Pali, which is a term that is fundamental and that in the Mahayana perspective, starting from Nagarjuna, coincides, is used as a synonym, and Nagarjuna explains this synonym with shunyata, which means emptiness. Shunya, empty, shunyata, emptiness. So the term, in its deep meaning, was very useful, and the contribution, by the way, of the speaker that preceded me. So this term, which is a very familiar term in Buddhism, points at the model, the paradigm of the connection of the phases that were mentioned before, the phases that make up in their determination the dimension of existence. And it's very interesting, the interpretation that underlines the historicity and the contingency of self.
Nello stesso tempo, nei testi,
at the same time, in the texts, we don't often find, together with the illustration, the description of the model, this type of expression. There is this, there is that, this appears, there is that, this ceases, the other one ceases. Now, according to the interpretation of some scholars, this would be a formula that sums up the type of dynamics or logics embedded in Paticca Samutpada, in the model that keeps all the faces together, and from which the relations would emerge, the relations that constitute the historical existence of self. So is some kind of basic function that associates X to Y in its emergence or in its cessation. So in this sense, I would obtain, because I think that at least in Nagarjuna, this interpretation, causal interpretation or conditional interpretation is kept, so I would keep it too, even though previously it has been criticized. The causal interpretation of Paticca Samutpada doesn't imply an assumption of this type of causality as a linear causality that puts in relationship an A substance with a B substance. The extraordinarily interesting aspect of this topic is deflagrating this type of representation of causality, which is linear, has one direction, and connects substantial elements. Instead,
possiamo dire così, o comunque attraverso questa
through this formula, we could understand the way in which events emerge as events of a reticular experience.
Possibile individuare, distinguere e separare nessun elemento sostanziale.
We cannot detect any substantial element because every element that we might detect is the result of intersections and not the principles and the starting point of vectors.
No, poi di intersecarsi. E quindi io credo che sia proprio questa.
So I think that it's the idea of conditionality which works on different levels. This form of co-causality which acts in the emergence of events as events of experience, and they are all depending on the experience, obviously, the representation of consciousness, contact, etc.
Perché abbiamo già.
Now, I won't dwell upon this matter because we've already heard it, and I'm going to get straight to here. I'm going to get to Nagarjuna. So, what is clarified here is the correspondence, the semantic correspondence of the two expressions, shunyata and pratikya samutpada. This starts from a work, a lesser work, which has a powerful logic, the extermination of mistakes or the extermination of dissent. In stanza 22, Nagarjuna gives us a definition of emptiness. The definition of emptiness recalls the conditioned, co-conditioned, concausal nature that we experience when things emerge to existence, things that we still have to name as such. So the conditioned and dependent existence of things or beings, some translate, this is defined emptiness. What exists, conditioned and dependent, is, as a matter of fact, deprived of svabhava, the text says, of being in the self, or nature, identity. Niali, in his extraordinary translation, translates one's own nature. So there's different translations. Emptiness only means this: the being conditioned of beings, the fact that beings emerge conditionally implies ipso facto the absence of being of beings. Beings are produced, are interbeings. They cannot be beings.
A mio avviso è la formulazione, la definizione.
So maybe the clearer definition that we find in the Nagarjuna text on emptiness is the first form of explaining this correspondence between emptiness and dependence, which is furtherly clarified here in these two very famous stanzas. I'm sure most of you know them, 18 and 19 of chapter 24 of the stanzas of the Middle Way. We maintain that this dependent co-origination, so pratikya samutpada, is emptiness, shunyata. This is a linguistic designation. Now things get complicated. This is a linguistic designation. Prajñatyupadaya, the text says, it is a metaphor. So a metaphoric designation is translated by Gnoli, and it is exactly the middle way. You all know this. I'm not going to go back on this, but I would like to just remind you that Nagarjuna is considered in the Buddhist tradition the predecessor of a school that would represent a second turn of the Dharma, the second turn of the wheel of Dharma, which refers to the original teaching, the teaching that, according to tradition, was given by Buddha as the middle way. So in Nagarjuna, not only we have a quote, direct quote to the suttas of the canon, but also a reference, precise reference of the need to keep on the way. And you know it better than me, this has nothing to do with a median collocation, with an equal composition of extreme, with a synthesis. The middle way is the most radical and complex and impossible way to go to, because it means that you realize something by eliminating any possible position. So it's a reference, it's a paradox. So stanza 19, as nothing is given that is not co-originated independence, co-produced, relevant, interdependent, conditioned, determined. Something that is not empty is not even given. So empty is not something that denounces the fact that some things that constitute our experience is the experience itself we do of the eye, of things as possessions of the eye that are not substantial. They don't have any autonomy, they don't have any consistency of their own, and they don't have any concrete relationship in premise discursive thought and conscientious experience. So after this sort of quick recognition of certain terms, why should we say emptiness as a form of the world, and why we should refer this expression to the possibility for thoughts and contemporary philosophy to extract some teachings from the Buddhist lesson? Because such perspective is a perspective that is certainly inscribed, as you all know, within an esoteriologic path. Buddhist way is a way of salvation from suffering that chains us to the flux of events. It chains us to the becoming. It chains us to samsara. It is a way that should have an objective, quote unquote, namely removing, stopping suffering, ceasing suffering and pain. This ceasing can be actualized only through the experience of disappropriation. Disappropriation, the experience of detachment, of non-attachment. First of all, to the idea, to the persuasion of the self, of the I and of the mind, but also, and we could maybe say that it is through these latest elements that the ego is fed, through detachment from the presidiums of I, mental representational, and from the conscience. All of the representations through which the subject, the historical contingent subject, desperately tries to make something out of the world and keep standing as autonomous and independent substance. Now, this way, which is a way to salvation, a very difficult way to follow, points out, and we've also seen it in the previous contributions, implies an outlook, the capacity of transforming the ordinary look we give to the world in a different look, in a different observation. This is at stake, and so the possibility of transforming the way we look at the world is the key, is an extraordinary opportunity to reason on an alternative, on a look that indicates something with which we can look at modernity in many different levels. So, a look that is able to desubstantialize, subtract the identity presidiums, the dogmatic identities. So everything that fundamentally constitutes violence at every level. Of course, now we are talking about epistemic violence, representations, the violence of representations that want to dominate the world or tell the world how it should be to function in an adequate way. Now, I am going back to the Buddhist thought to show its complexity and subtlety. So the real challenge is to offer and propose a way of looking at the world that does not repropose itself as a way of looking at the world as the only possible way, or as the strongest perspective, or as a sole perspective, or as the real and adequate perspective that submits the other perspectives and flattens and choose every other perspective. This is fundamentally the problem. So I'm going to try and synthesize here. I am only giving you some sort of food for thought. What does emptiness mean as a shape of the world, as a form of the world? This expression can become very dangerous because it could mean, and this was well known starting from the original teaching, emptiness is a form of the world which can become the new dogma, the new doctrine, the theory with a capital T that encompasses every comprehension and experience. So we should be careful, because seeing the world as empty is certainly seeing the world as a combination of interdependent events. This is a great skill. It is an upgrade compared to a realistic, naive vision that attributes to the world and to the things of the world substance of their own. But seeing the world as empty cannot become the only perspective of accessing the experience of the world, because in a therapeutic outlook inside a path that wishes to conduct people towards emancipation, this would mean to go back to attachment, go back to being attached to the teaching on emptiness or to the teaching of Buddha, attachment to the raft, so to speak. So this is the point which was already said. Nagarjuna was already quoted beforehand when my colleague talked about the 13th chapter of the stanzas of the Middle Way. The victorious have announced that emptiness is abandoning all theories, is letting go of all theories, perspectives, drishti. And as for those who make of emptiness a theory, these have been named uncurable. And then we have a famous passage of the 22nd chapter where Nagarjuna talks about emptiness as the assumption of emptiness is that it is substantial, endowed with its own dogmatic dimension. Nagarjuna talks about the tetralem that you will all know. You shouldn't say that something is empty, that is not empty, that is empty and not empty, that is not empty and not empty. These are nothing but linguistic designation. Again, linguistic designation, such as emptiness is a linguistic designation. Here is using prajnatyartam, in the other case, prajnatyurpadaya. Remember, Milinda Pagna is a name, a convention, a sign, nothing that corresponds, nothing that can become
attaccamento.
A domain of attachment. So I will show you just because I prepared it, but I think it's very interesting to talk about some issues. These are two books that many of you will know. And Wester, that dealt with Nagarjuna a lot, Jan Westerhoff, and wrote these two volumes that provide an attempt of reading reality. In fact, these texts want to propose to the contemporary philosophical debate the hypothesis that it is possible to do philosophy independently from any foundationalism, namely subtracting oneself to ontology. And a lot of people think this is not possible. But with Nagarjuna, maybe we do have the possibility of a breach into this system. I'm going forwards, and I just wanted to show you that we had some attempts to think together about the meaning of interdependence and extending it to the dimension of the very sad current events. So now I'm not going to bore you on this idea.
Inteso qual è il punto. Però...
So to conclude, so I can sort of reconnect with the conclusions of Matteo Cestari, Professor Matteo Cestari. I wanted to show you just this, namely the understanding of Pratitya Samutpada as the dependent origination, and how we have tried to explain the meaning, how comprehending Pratitya Samutpada can transform the way of conceiving and interpreting contagion if we talk about the pandemic. So I've done a couple of slides here. Non-seeing, so the perspective of not grasping the interdependence, to stay blind towards the deep nature that connects everything that we experience. So non-seeing, this universal interdependence, shows and highlights the notorious side of this law. What do we say by not seeing? We say that our nature of men and women in a biological and physiological sphere, social, local, national and supranational and private sphere, condemn us to contagion. So when we see, when we are inside, when we recognize the geometrical side, the salvation side of the law of interdependence, we open our eyes and we can say that our nature of men and women in the biological, physiological sphere, private sphere, social, local, national, and supranational sphere is a nature that exposes ourselves naturally to contagion. So it is from knowledge, and only from knowledge, which we can transform ourselves. We can modify our outlook and go to any type of prevention and salvation. Thank you.